The Lately Worm of Spindlesone Crag. English stories often refer to snake-like dragons as worms. This story tells the tale of a lately worm, or loathsome dragon. There once was a king who lived in a castle in the north of England with his wife, their daughter Margaret, and son Duncan. As soon as Duncan was old enough, he left in search of fame and fortune, hunting trolls in distant lands. Margaret decided to stay behind to manage the castle with her mother. Shortly after Duncan left, the queen died, quite suddenly. The king was distraught and shut himself away in his rooms. No one could help him. Finally, in despair, Margaret wrote to Edwin, one of her father's closest friends, and asked him to pay them a visit. Edwin did his best to comfort the king. "Why don't we go on a hunting trip, your majesty?" asked Edwin. "The fresh air will do you good." "Perhaps you're right," the king replied with a sigh. "Margaret can run things while I'm gone." A few days into the trip, the hunting party was caught in a terrible storm. Soaking wet and shaking with cold, they sought shelter in an out-of-the-way inn. There, the king met a beautiful woman named Isabel, who made him laugh for the first time since his beloved wife had died. She enchanted him so much that the king forgot about hunting altogether, and soon his grief too. He spent the rest of the time in her company, listening to her tales and her magical laughter. "Isabella, you are surely the most wonderful woman I've ever met," said the king, on the final day of the trip. "Please come back to the castle as my queen." "As your majesty wishes," replied Isabella. No one noticed the satisfied smirk she gave as she turned away. The king and Isabella were married the next day. As they slowly made their way home, Edwin rode ahead to the castle. "The king shall return in 3 days with a new queen," he announced, and heralds were sent throughout the kingdom to share the joyful news. Princess Margaret was upset to think of someone in her mother's place, but she wanted her father to be happy, so she told the staff to prepare a great feast. "We must celebrate the arrival of our new queen," she said. Stewards hastily hung banners in the great hall, and delicious smells wafting from the kitchen began to fill every passageway. Servants swept, dusted, and polished until every corner of the castle gleamed. Messengers were sent with invitations to every lord and lady in the kingdom, who declared one and all that they would be delighted to attend the feast. "We're ready," said Princess Margaret, smiling at the head steward 2 days later, as the first guests started to arrive. The following morning, the king and queen themselves rolled up in their carriage. As the king led his new wife to her throne, Princess Margaret cleared her throat. "Welcome to the castle, my new mother," she said. "I wish you the longest and happiest of reigns." The guests filling the great hall applauded her welcoming words. "What a kind and thoughtful girl," declared one. A more gracious princess would be impossible to find," agreed another. The new queen smiled and nodded as cheers for Princess Margaret rang around the hall. But, deep down, the queen envied her stepdaughter's popularity. "There certainly isn't room in this castle for both of us," thought Isabella. "I want everyone in the kingdom to love me, and only me." Princess Margaret, watching Queen Isabella, thought that her eyes looked hard, and even though she was smiling, the smile looked forced. "Who are you?" wondered Princess Margaret. She was right to wonder. The dreadful truth was the new queen was really a witch. How easy it was to enchant the silly king, Queen Isabella was thinking. Soon I shall be in charge of this realm, and everyone in it will bow to my least command. She noticed Margaret looking at her curiously. I will need a special spell for you, annoying Margaret," she thought. That night, as the guests and servants slept, Isabella crept to the very dampest, darkest dungeon she could find, deep underneath the castle. Here she could perform her wicked magic in secret. As the moon rose to its highest point in the night sky, she cast a spell. "A lately worm ye now shall be, a vile dragon never free, until thy brother atop thy head puts kisses 1, 2, 3. Thunder crashed and lightning flashed, and the queen knew her spell had worked. The next morning, Princess Margaret's maid went to wake her. Opening the door, she let out a piercing scream. "Where's the princess?" she shrieked. A monstrous dragon sprawled on the sheets, hissing and spitting. Slowly, it uncoiled its enormous tail and climbed down from the bed. "It's wearing the princess's bracelet," cried the maid, pointing at the dragon's forearm. "Has the princess turned into a dragon?" Her screams brought more servants running. Trays of bread and fruit clattered to the ground, and flagons of juice and coffee went flying as servants carrying breakfast collided with servants who were running for their lives. The dragon crawled through corridors and down staircases, scattering terrified guests and knights in its wake. It slithered through the castle gates and across the drawbridge, until eventually it reached a cave not far from the castle, nestled in the Spindlesone Crag. From her chamber in the tallest tower in the castle, the queen looked out towards the cave and reflected on a job well done. She could just make out puffs of steam and flickers of flame. The most popular girl in the kingdom has been reduced to a lazy worm. Now the people have no choice but to focus their love and attention on me, thought Isabella with a grin. Soon people from all corners of the realm came to learn of the destructive lazy worm of Spindlesone Crag. Wherever the dragon became hungry, which was often, it ate everything in sight. Every night, the dragon devoured entire fields of sheep and cattle, gobbled up the fish in the fish ponds, and gulped down rivers and lakes. Soon, it was flying further afield to satisfy its endless hunger and thirst. As supplies of food and water began to run low, the people living in the nearest town to the cave became desperate. "We'll starve if the dragon keeps munching its way through the entire kingdom," said one. "But we can't slay the dragon. It might be Princess Margaret," chimed in another. "We could ask the warlock," suggested a third voice, tentatively. Everyone kept away from the warlock, mainly because he seemed to prefer his own company. The warlock may know what to do. And so a small group set out for the warlock's rickety old hut, deep in the woods. "Please help us," they begged. "We're running out of food and water." The warlock's beard crackled and popped, as if it was full of fireworks, while he pondered the problem. "Don't mind the sparks. They help me think," he said. "For sure, the dragon doesn't mean to cause such destruction. It simply can't control its hunger. Each night, leave the milk of 7 cows at the entrance to the cave. That ought to keep it satisfied for now. But if the dragon is indeed Princess Margaret, as you suspect, the only way to free her from the curse is to send for her brother Duncan." The townsfolk did exactly as the warlock advised. Every evening, they lugged bucket after bucket of fresh milk to the cave, and the dragon was satisfied. Meanwhile, a group of brave volunteers went in search of Duncan. They crossed terrifying seas, navigated magical forests, and finally caught up with Duncan in northern Sweden, where the king's son was rounding up a particularly vicious band of mountain trolls. "Duncan, thank goodness we found you," said one of the volunteers, just as the prince's knights caught the last of the trolls in an enormous net. "A wicked witch has enchanted your father, and your sister has vanished." Duncan immediately gathered his knights. "Our troll-hunting adventures are to be cut short," he announced. "We must return home at once." For days, Duncan and his crew of knights battled rough waves and powerful storms in their efforts to get home. If they thought the return voyage was hard, it was nothing compared to the welcome that awaited them at the castle. Isabella had heard of the expedition to seek Duncan. Every day she paced up and down the battlements, fearing an attack. Each evening, wrapped in a silk shawl, as black as the night that wrapped itself around the castle, she sat in the dungeon and wove her plans. When Duncan's ship at last sailed into view, she was ready. Waving her arms above her head in an elaborate pattern, the queen conjured waves as tall as trees and winds as sharp as lances. Undeterred, Duncan kept advancing. So the queen cast spells over the Laidly Worm, forcing the dragon to guard the entrance to the castle bay. Whenever Duncan tried to approach, the dragon whipped its great tail and sent the ship flying away from the shore. No matter how hard Duncan's crew rowed, they simply couldn't get past the mighty dragon. "Retreat!" roared Duncan. "Go to the next bay. We'll have to approach the castle on foot." "Ha!" thought the queen, seeing the rowers pull in their oars and the ship sail away. "How feeble-hearted! He's given up already." Out of sight in the next bay, Duncan and his knights made their way ashore. Silently they crept around to the castle and approached the dragon, determined to slay the beast. But just as Duncan prepared to strike, the Laidly Worm began to speak. To his surprise, the sound it produced wasn't the terrifying roar he had expected, but his sister's voice. "Duncan, wait!" cried the Laidly Worm. "It's me, Princess Margaret." Duncan suspected a trick. The very same dragon, just a short while ago, had nearly wrecked his ship with its lashing tail. "Why should I trust you?" demanded Duncan. "Prove that you are my sister, or I'll slay you on the spot." "Who else but your sister would know that you once lost an arm wrestle with an ogre and paid him 10 gold pieces not to tell anyone?" The dragon snapped. "You said you'd keep that a secret," hissed Duncan, his face reddening. "You did ask," said the dragon. "Now please break this enchantment. You have to kiss the top of my head 3 times, it added, bowing its massive scaly head before Duncan. Trusting that the Laidly Worm was indeed his sister, Duncan kissed the dragon on top of its bumpy and slightly smelly head. Pinching his nose tight, Duncan scrunched up his eyes and gave the dragon 2 more kisses. At once, the dragon let out an enormous roar, and Duncan was convinced he had been tricked. Slowly, he opened his eyes. To his delight and huge relief, there stood his sister Margaret. The Laidly Worm had vanished. "Oh, well done, brother," said Princess Margaret. "Now, to rescue our father from his enchantment." Unsure how to defeat the wicked queen, the siblings visited the warlock for his advice. "Take this rowan twig and touch her with it," he told them. "You should be happy with the result." Duncan and Princess Margaret set off for the castle at once. They found their stepmother in the dungeon, desperately looking through her books of spells. "If only you had stayed away, Duncan," spat Isabella, "I would have ruled this kingdom forevermore." "This kingdom has no wish for such a wicked and cruel queen," said Margaret, jabbing Isabella with a rowan's twig. For a moment nothing happened. Had the warlock's plan failed? Then Isabella let out a great shriek. She began to shrivel and shrink and turned into a grotesque, slimy toad. The toad hissed at Princess Margaret and Duncan before hopping away, never to be seen again. "Let's find father," said Margaret. "Perhaps he is free of her vile spell." The king was rubbing his eyes as Margaret and Duncan rushed into his room. "What happened?" asked the king with a yawn. "I feel as if I've been asleep for months." He listened in shock as his children explained everything. "Isabella was a witch," said Margaret. "She cast a spell on you, but don't worry, she won't be bothering us any more." "How can I ever thank you?" sighed the king. "From this day on, you must rule the kingdom, Margaret. I think I will retire." The following week, an enormous banquet was held to celebrate Margaret's coronation and Duncan's return. The castle rang with joyous cries and laughter. "Hooray!" cheered the guests, "for Princess Margaret is now our queen, and her wicked stepmother nothing but a Laidly toad." The end.